This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, here are our top stories. Boris Johnson has announced that a fee that overseas health and care workers have to pay to access the NHS is to be withdrawn. The government has ordered 10 million units of a new COVID-19 antibody test said to be 100% reliable. And Sky News has witnessed French patrol boats shadowing migrants across the Channel. 57 migrants have been taken into custody in Dover. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. That's the first look at what's on the front pages of the newspapers as they arrive in. Well, in the next half hour, we'll have a look at what's making the headlines with the columnist for the Irish News, Alison, and the columnist for the Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens. So let's have a look. What is on some of those front pages? The Eye leads with a second government U-turn in 24 hours. That's the fee that foreign NHS workers pay to use the health service, which will now be withdrawn. The Guardian says the decision came not only as a result of pressure from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, but also from Conservative backbenchers. The Metro reports on a sharp drop in the number of new COVID-19 cases in London. There have been fewer than 100 in the past fortnight. The development of 2 new types of tests leads the Mail to ask, could this be the biggest virus hope we've had? According to The Times, people who've recovered from the virus could be given special certificates to exempt them from social distancing. The Mirror says 10 million Brits could benefit from the tests, and that's also the lead story in The Express. The Telegraph understands that MPs will consider legislation to let police conduct spot checks on the homes of people who've arrived back in Britain amid the pandemic. That's to check they're adhering to the 14-day quarantine period. Alison's paper, that's the Irish News, reports that children there may not go back to school even after the summer holidays are over. And the FT reports saying that there could be renewed protests in Hong Kong over the Chinese government's plans to impose its own national security laws there. The Sun has the story of an incident involving an unnamed England footballer's girlfriend who was allegedly caught carrying a stun gun at an airport. And the Star tells us about a parking dispute between Good Morning Britain presenters Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid. We're joined tonight to look through some of those front pages in a bit more detail by Alison and Peter Hitchens. Thank you both very much for being with us for our newspaper review. Good to see you both. We'll kick off with the Daily Telegraph, which has got this story about police giving new powers to enforce the quarantine that people may have to abide by if they enter the United Kingdom. Peter, let's go to you first. Do you think this is a good move or powers too far?
Well, it's all part of the plan to ruin the travel industry even more than it's already been ruined, on top of all the other industries that the government has been ruining over the past few weeks. And one sees this endless prospect of people in peak caps turning up in one's life saying, have you been here? Have you done this? Are you still staying in your house? And the nightmare continues. I'm just amazed that people put up with this sort of thing in a country which used to pride itself on its independent-mindedness, that we're being threatened with incessant interventions in our lives by officialdom, which actually will almost certainly produce no good results. If they were going to have a serious quarantine on people coming in and out of the country, surely it should have been months ago, not now.
Alison, I'm interested to know what your take is on this. Is this a nightmare, this kind of incessant checks on people's lives?
Well, I think it's interesting because as a security journalist, had that legislation at any other time, you would have had, thousands of people out protesting in the street at normal times. So this new legislation, this would require new legislation in Parliament to allow police to go and check on people meant to be self-isolating for 14 days. Not sure that anyone might agree to add more legislation on top of what already is pretty draconian measures. But I do think that we have to remember the virus actually came into the country, and it did come from foreign tourists and from people travelling from coronavirus hotspots at that time. So there does need to be some checks on ports and airports. Now, I think in places like South Korea, they're putting bracelets and tags on people. That's clearly a measure that people here are not going to agree to. But I do think that there needs to be some checks to make sure when people do come from countries where the coronavirus is still causing major problems, that they can't just come into the country and go and mingle or go back to work as they would have and spread it and potentially cause a second wave. There does need to be some checks, but I'm not sure adding more legislation on top of what already is a pretty draconian act is the answer.
I mean, is that a point, though, Peter? You were saying that if this was going to happen, then this should have happened previously. But if the levels of the virus in the UK reduce in comparison to elsewhere, then isn't it a good idea to make sure people aren't bringing it back in again?
Well, there isn't actually any particular evidence that the levels of the virus in different countries are behaving any differently. The virus seems to pattern. There is a rise in infections, a rise in tragic deaths, and then they peak and then they fall away. If you had been going to have a serious system of quarantine, then the time to have it would have been when the virus was coming into the country from abroad, whenever that was. But to come up with it now and then to introduce some scheme whereby people will face spot checks if they come back from abroad, all this will do, and it's obvious to anybody who's thinking of traveling, all this will do is it will simply put people off undertaking any travel at all, because if you take a 2-week holiday, you don't want to then spend the next fortnight boxed up in your house waiting for some official to say that you can go to work. People won't do it. It's just another measure taken by a government which has completely carelessly strangled an entire advanced economy and doesn't seem to have any idea of how to get out of the mess it's got into. I just can't sympathize with it at all. I can't see, if you were going to have any argument for it, it would have had to have been long ago and not now. But there doesn't seem to be any argument for it now, except the fact the government now has powers to behave like this, so it will use them.
2 weeks trapped inside your house could get rid of that holiday spirit pretty quickly. I'll take your point on that one. Alison, let's talk about another story on a lot of the front pages today. These are the immunity tests that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was keen to talk about at the daily briefing today. The Times is saying that this idea that people could have immunity certificates to allow them to ignore social distancing could be back on the table. Do you think this is quite exciting, or do you think we should perhaps not get too carried away?
I think that, we need to realise that these tests aren't scientifically proven. They haven't been shown to be 100%. But if we could get an accurate immunity test, well, that means that people could undertake extra duties. So people who have these certificates and who have shown to have some degree of immunity then could take up the jobs that allow other vulnerable people to shield away from further distances in time. My brother is almost sure he had coronavirus, but he didn't get a test. It was in the very early days of it. He has disabled children. He would like to be able to go out and do things with them. If he could have the immunity test, I think that would be perfect for someone like him. I think for care workers, and especially people who work in elderly care and old people's homes, to know that they have staff who are immune, that means you could move other staff out of the homes and monitor that and get a grip on that. So I think if the science was correct, these tests would be perfect. I'm just not sure we're quite there yet in terms of the science.
I mean,
in terms of the accuracy.
There's a couple of other papers covering this as well. The Daily Mirror has got game-changer tests for 10 million Brits, saying that the NHS workers and carers will be first to get checks to show if they've had the virus. And that story as well on some of the other front pages too. Peter, do you think there is a bit of a risk if we do go down this route of immunity certificates, that we could almost have like a two-tier country where half of us, or perhaps less than half, 17% in London, are able to go to the pubs, carry on exactly as they liked, and then the others are trapped in their houses?
Well, it reminds me of Ronald Reagan's great warning that the most terrifying words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." The idea that the British government could manage a system of this kind effectively or efficiently or well is so ludicrous, given its incompetence in almost every area it's being, particularly electronic things, but also all the attempts at testing which have so far taken place. How is this going to work? People are presumably going to be able to I wouldn't dream of encouraging any such activity, but can you imagine a certificate of such value existing without people forging them and providing them on the blanket? How are people going to check them? What sort of system of bureaucracy and checking could conceivably cope with it? It's a recognition of the fact people can't stand this very much longer. This national work to rule, where we're constantly stifled by foolish regulations. But the idea that it could be got rid of in this way seems to me to be fanciful, given everything we know about the way in which government performs. Why not just do what we've done in the past and stop quarantining healthy people?
Interesting stuff there. Alison, I was enjoying your reaction to some of that as well. What's your take on what Peter was saying?
I find Peter's grumpiness delightful. He's definitely the yin to my yang. I'm trying to keep positive during lockdown, whereas Peter's obviously taking a very different approach to it. It is true. I mean, the government hasn't been able to manage the testing strategy effectively. In Northern Ireland, the devolved assembly has had a disaster in relation to testing. We know that the app that they're proposing at this point in time wouldn't be compatible with the app that they're going to use in the south of Ireland, despite the fact that we live in such close proximity. So you can see how all this going forward is going to be very difficult to manage. But I do think that, people who have had the virus would like to know they had it, even if it's just because they're caring for elderly relatives or caring for vulnerable or shielding people. It would be good to have that reassurance that you're not a danger to other people. And I think for healthy people, it's fine to say that we can all go back out and go to work, but we need to make sure that we're not a danger to the people who we love and who we care for and who we're in contact with during the day. And that's the key thing. It's not an every man for himself type scenario.
Peter, do you want to come in? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. People who are genuinely concerned are free to stay at home, and I think they should be very much encouraged to do so if they're genuinely frightened that they're in danger of being infected. And it would be quite right for them to be both permitted and encouraged to do so if that's what they want to do. And we should look after them at home while it's going on. For those who want to go out and live a normal life, whatever age they are, however vulnerable they may officially be, should be free to go and do that in a free country. That's what we should do. And life isn't worth living if we spend our entire life living in fear of things, as the government seems to be wanting to encourage us to do. There's the other thing. There's 66.6 million people at the last count in this country. How long is it going to take to test them all, to find out? And while you wait for all those tests to take place at a piffling rate of maybe a couple of 100,000 a week, while you wait for that to happen, those people who are in the clear and don't know, what are they supposed to do? The thing is fundamentally, like the whole shutdown of the country, impractical and ludicrous. And if we had a sense of proportion and we'd retained the sense of humor we used to have, we'd be laughing at it. The thing which it often seems to me this government really needs is someone to really, really laugh at the ludicrousness of its policies. I think that's possibly the only way out of it. But this must be one of the more ludicrous suggestions I've heard. It cannot be done in practice.
There you go. Very strong words there from both of you. Thank you so much for a very lively first half of the newspaper review. I look forward to hearing your opinions on some of the other front pages as well. Coming up. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With us now, Alison Morris and Peter Hitchens. Thanks very much for staying with us over the break. Let's crack on with the next story, shall we? And this is on the front page of the Eye about the Prime Minister forced into a U-turn on that charge that NHS workers and care workers from abroad have to pay, or did have to pay, before accessing healthcare services. Now, the thing that strikes me about the story is that Number 10 say the Prime Minister wanted to do it because of his own experience, but then only 24 hours earlier, he was defending it. How does that work, Alison?
It's ridiculous. When we have, the Prime Minister standing on the doorstep of Downing Street clapping for NHS workers on a Thursday night and then saying that the workers from abroad who have kept us alive, these are the workers who were called low skill when there's no such thing. The cleaners, the porters, the domestics, who without which the death toll would be much higher. We're going to have to pay £624 of a fee from October if they needed healthcare. And if you're a cleaner or a porter or on a low-paid job, that is a fortune. And I think that this is a real example of Keir Starmer coming out of the blocks running. We have seen him being really impressive in Prime Minister's questions during the last few weeks. We've seen him challenging the Prime Minister in relation to this fee. And I think, in comparison to Jeremy Corbyn, you can see, a really dynamic Labour leader emerging. And I think that among that, and also the public outrage, is one of the things that's forced the Prime Minister to do a U-turn on this. But there should never have needed to be a U-turn. I mean, for anyone to use any kind of common sense, the Prime Minister said it was common decency to reverse it. It should have been common sense not to implement it in the first place.
Peter, what do you think? Sometimes I think perhaps people are too quick to cry U-turn when actually people quite appreciate changing minds.
Well, sure, but it was a brilliant piece of opposition beyond doubt. They picked a subject which they couldn't really lose on. But it's interesting to see how, if you look at the Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, resisting it, he points out that he's been treated by a nurse from Portugal and he's very sympathetic, but he also points out how very much it will cost to do, and therefore he's against it. He didn't see, as major politicians often don't, at the time these things happen, how big it would get. It was too simple, too straightforward, and it contradicted too much the Conservative Party's current attempt to claim that it is the party that is more deeply in love with the NHS even than Labour. So I think as soon as he got back to Downing Street, all the advisors said, Prime Minister, you've got to give way on this. And he might have said, well, how do we find the money? And they said, we'll work that out later. And it is, of course, a problem. There is a lot of money involved, and it has to be found from somewhere else. And you can bet your life that within 6 months or so, people will be saying, well, where's all this money gone?
Okay.
It used to be in the NHS budget. But it was a brilliant piece of opposition, no question about it. Whether it's actually advance the cause of anything in the end, it remains to be seen.
Now, we are running out of time, but I'm keen to squeeze in one more story from the Irish News, Alison's paper, about schools in Northern Ireland and what they're planning to do. Can you just explain what's happening?
We only got this news today as to what the plan is for schools. And so we have different school holidays. Our children are off in July and August, so they won't be going back before the end of this term. And we're now being told that in September they won't be going straight back either, that there'll only be key years going back. And I'm minded that lockdown has been a privilege for so many children, are probably enjoying it and getting time with their parents. But for others from deprived and socially deprived backgrounds, it's been a total nightmare, and they've fell greatly behind. And unfortunately, we have real social and educational achievement.
I have to come in there. Thank you both very much for a lively paper review. We'll be hearing more from you both in the next hour. Thank you. Lots more coming up on Sky News at 11.